Welcome to Edinburgh's Museum of Childhood. The first museum in the world dedicated to the history of childhood. Deceptively small from the outside, the museum has 5 galleries full of childhood treasures used by generations of British children. The collection includes toys, games, books, costume, photographs, and objects representing children's lives at home and school. It all began in 1955 and was the idea of one man, Patrick Murray. Patrick Murray was an optician by profession, a town councillor, and a collector of childhood memorabilia. On hearing that 2 dolls belonging to Queen Victoria had been sent to London because there was no suitable venue to display them in Scotland, he decided to start a new museum. In 1955, the council agreed he could use space at Ladies' Stairs House Museum for a display of childhood objects, which he described as a pitiful handful of soldiers, building blocks, and railway stuff of my own. The display was immediately popular with visitors, and donations began to flood in. By 1957, the collection had grown so large that extra space was needed, and an 18th century tenement in the High Street was specially converted to house it. The first 2 floors of the museum were opened by Lord Provost Ian Johnson Gilbert in August 1957, with the words, "We dedicate this building to perpetuating memories of childhood." In 1962, Patrick Murray became the full-time curator of the museum, and among his many talents, proved to be a brilliant publicist. He always insisted he didn't like children and claimed to have a rooted conviction that children are only tolerable after their baths and on their way to bed. Before retiring in 1974, he said the collections were once again outgrowing the building, and in 1982, the council purchased the adjacent building to create an extension. The extended museum was opened on the 21st of July 1986 by 10-year-old Susan Gibson, who won a competition run by the Evening News to be a VIC for the day, Very Important Child. The museum now had 70% more display space and better facilities, such as a lift and gift shop. The gift shop is at the front of the building, and visitors then enter the first gallery, Changing Childhood. Refurbished in 2017 to 18, this gallery introduces the scope of the museum, showcasing the breadth of the collections. 3 themes of life, learn and play explore what has remained constant in childhood experience as well as what has changed. Visitors can flip through a digital photo album, which presents a chronological look at family life. Showing how families have celebrated the same milestones. A new baby, starting school, family holidays, Christmas, even though the family unit has changed. The large families of the Victorian era became smaller during the early 20th century. While today, we often have blended families with different combinations of parents and siblings. In the life section, we look at 3 topics: parenting, family entertainment, and appearance. Parenting considers the sources of advice parents have used and some of the issues which they've grappled with. In the past, growing up was seen as a relatively simple process. But since the early 20th century and the development of psychology, childhood has increasingly been seen as the most important stage of development in a person's life. Parents have worried more about getting it wrong, especially when they face choices, such as what kinds of food children should eat and whether they should be immunised against diseases. Family entertainment looks at how the family unit has spent leisure time at home. From the turn of the 20th century, when board games were particularly popular, through the 1920s and 30s, dominated by the wireless or radio, and on to the emergence of television in the 1950s. For children, the most popular radio programme was Children's Hour. Presenters known as the wireless aunties and uncles in regions around the country provided entertainment and comfort, particularly during World War II. Television would eventually take over as the main form of family entertainment. The first great star of children's television was Muffin the Mule, the puppet who appeared with Annette Mills along with other animal characters. Muffin was the first TV spin-off toy and also appeared in books, comics, and on all sorts of household items. In the appearance section, we discuss how the way children are dressed reflects their lifestyles and how they're treated. The museum has hundreds of items of clothing, but we only have space here for a very few. These show how children's clothes have changed over the last 150 years, from being formal and restricting to being much more relaxed and comfortable. They include a child's corset, a velvet suit known as a Little Lord Fauntleroy suit, a summer dress from the 1950s, and a selection of sandals. School and education have played a large part in the lives of children for centuries. But it's only since the late 19th century that education has been compulsory for all children. In the Learn section of the gallery, we look at how the Education Scotland Act of 1872 changed life for children here. A timeline shows some of the milestones in the development of elementary schooling, and there are simple games which tell visitors about the 1872 Education Act and demonstrate the skills needed for learning by rote. The displays include items used in several of the new board schools created in Edinburgh to cope with the increased numbers of children attending school, such as a medal presented as a reward for perfect attendance at the Dean's School in 1908, a needlework sampler made at Stockbridge Public School in 1889, and a book given as a prize at Slateford School in 1897. Edinburgh was at the forefront of nursery education and the kindergarten movement at the beginning of the 20th century. This was in response to the needs of children in poor urban areas, such as the Canongate in Edinburgh. On display is some material from St Saviour's Child Garden Nursery, the second nursery to be set up in Edinburgh in 1906. Supported by Old St Paul's Episcopal Church, it was run by Lillian Hardy. Who dedicated most of her life to improving conditions for young children in this area. The handwritten document on display, The Life History of a Slum Child, is one of a set of fundraising booklets which she produced, with a heartfelt plea for contributions. From the very beginning, the children wore a blue smock with red collar and cuffs, and the one on display shows how this practice continued into the 1950s. In the play section are some of the most popular toys from recent generations. Toys which have endured over a long period of time, such as board games, construction toys, dolls, and toys designed for babies and toddlers. It was also vital to include the development of electronic and video games, which has transformed the way that children and adults play. These developments began longer ago than we often think. For example, this voice-controlled toy, Radio Rex, was invented in the 1920s. Developments in this area move so rapidly that many of the computer games on display here are already very outdated, except perhaps for the Xbox. It will be interesting to see if their lifespan is as long as that of Monopoly or Barbie. We also wanted to include imaginary play, the kind of play experience that doesn't always include toys. This is often inspired by children's literature, which has been a rich source of entertainment since the late 19th century, including fairy tales, adventure stories, fantasy, and school stories. Imaginary play can also be based on role play and real-life situations. So, in this section, we have books for people to browse through, dressing up costumes, and a feature wall with familiar characters and little surprise elements, such as the tiny doors. There's also an area where visitors can create a masterpiece with magnetic building tiles. Upstairs, Gallery 2 displays a variety of toys, including musical and optical toys, dolls' houses, and miniatures and toy vehicles. Musical toys, toys which make a sound, are among the first to be given to babies and young children as they produce an instant reaction. In the 18th century, musical toys became very sophisticated, following the development of the miniature clockwork movement. By the 1890s, musical boxes were very popular. And with the appearance of the gramophone, about 1900, toy versions soon appeared. During the 20th century, these were followed by toy record players and cassette players. And now, toy versions of musical devices are only for the very youngest. Our display of optical toys shows the great fascination with producing a moving image. This was of particular interest in the Victorian era, when there was a variety of new inventions. The kaleidoscope was the first, patented in 1815, which created a variety of patterns. In 1825, the thaumatrope was invented, followed by the phenakistoscope and the zoetrope in the 1830s. All of which tried to create a moving image by rotating a series of images at speed. These scientific toys were readily embraced by Victorian parents who were always keen on education. Following the invention of film, they were replaced in the 20th century by toy projectors, which could show still or moving film. Puppets are amongst the oldest toys, having been known in ancient civilizations. The most famous puppet show is Punch and Judy, which came to Britain about 1660. Once commonly seen at seaside venues around the country, Punch and Judy has fallen out of fashion, but the Museum of Childhood collection has several sets. On display here, visitors can see a set of puppets known as Dixon's Royal Marionettes. These were performed in Edinburgh in Princes Street Gardens by William and Jean Dixon from 1940 to 1953. Next to the puppets are several toy theatres, another popular Victorian entertainment, with coloured paper scenery and figures which could be made to act out plays and pantomimes. This gallery also has miniature toys of all kinds, farm and zoo figures, as well as dolls' house furniture and accessories. Domestic toys made in miniature were particularly aimed at girls in the 19th century. For example, these wooden grocer's shops, made about 1890. As well as shops, miniature kitchens were produced, some of which had working stoves, powered by methylated spirit burners. These toys were designed to be educational as well as entertaining, and reflect the domestic duties that lay ahead of girls at that time. This wooden butcher's shop may have been a toy or could have been made for display in a butcher's shop window. Visitors can also see examples of dolls' houses. Dolls' houses developed from the cabinets of miniature silver and furniture collected by adults and made by German and Dutch craftsmen in the 17th and 18th centuries. From the mid-19th century, these developed into playthings, and many were made by estate carpenters or talented relatives. By the 20th century, dolls' houses were being made commercially, most commonly by the firm of Triang. Stanbrigg Earl's is the largest doll's house in the collection, and probably larger than most. It was made in 1897 for Lena Graham Montgomery and was based on her family home in Hampshire. This was her second doll's house, as she had already run out of space in the first. She continued to collect for it throughout her life and had it extended so that it eventually had 19 rooms and boasted both electric light and running water. The house was often displayed to raise money for charity, until it was donated to the museum in the early 1960s, shortly before Miss Graham Montgomery died. While girls were given domestic toys, vehicles were considered suitable for boys. Many toys are modelled on real-life items and are made hot on the heels of new inventions. For example, the earliest passenger trains ran in the 1820s and 1830s and were soon an important subject for toy makers. The first models for children were steam-powered, with water boilers heated by methylated spirit burners. These would be considered too dangerous for children today, and were certainly messy. The amount of spilt water caused them to be known as dribblers or piddlers. In the late 19th century, clockwork trains were developed, followed by electric trains in the 1930s, both of which were much safer. Large sets were made with all sorts of accessories, such as buildings, trees, passengers, and luggage. The most well-known maker was Hornby, and by the 1950s, most families would have been able to afford one of their train sets. The museum also has a large collection of toy cars. The first die-cast miniature vehicle was a Model T Ford, made in 1914. But the large-scale production of toy cars began in 1934 with the Meccano Dinky series. Their main rivals were Corgi Toys and the Lesney Matchbox and models of yesteryear series. Crossing the bridge which joins the two parts of the building together, we come to Gallery 3, which displays over 700 dolls, soft toys, teddy bears, and automata. The Queen Anne doll is the oldest doll in the collection, which was designed purely as a toy. It was made about 1740 in the reign of Queen Anne, hence its name. Made of wood with painted features and sharp, pointed fingers, it shows the costume worn by fashionable women of the period. There are dolls of all kinds to see here, but one of the most popular is the shoe doll. This unique doll was made in London about 1905 by an inventive parent who couldn't afford to buy a doll. The head and body are made from the sole of an old shoe, and rags have been used to make arms and clothing. We are fortunate to have this doll, which might well have been thrown away. It was collected by Edward Lovett, who was interested in all kinds of cultures and folk history, and spent many years travelling to different communities. There, he would swap new dolls for those made by the local people, and he built up a large collection of dolls from all over the world. We also have a number of teddy bears on display here. Many people think that the teddy bear has been around for centuries because it is such an established part of childhood. In fact, the teddy bear is a relatively new toy, having been invented in 1903. Perhaps the Steiff bears, like this one, are still the most famous and sought after, with their trademark Knopf im Ohr, or button in ear. These early teddy bears were more like real bears, with humped backs and long arms and snouts, and were stuffed with hard material. During the 20th century, bears have been made from a variety of materials, but have generally become softer and cuddlier, like this fundraising bear from the Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh. Automata are sophisticated clockwork toys which are really more of an adult plaything. They would have been expensive and, in wealthy households, might have been brought out as an after-dinner entertainment or shown on special occasions. The Museum of Childhood has a few examples, such as this Puss in Boots figure made in the late 19th century. And a more tame cabbage-nibbling rabbit. Upstairs, Gallery 4 displays some of the hobbies and pastimes that children have enjoyed. One of the most popular pastimes has been reading. Children's literature took off in the late 19th century in Britain, when advances in technology made it possible to produce attractive books for entertainment as well as education. Universal education from the 1870s also meant that more children were able to read and enjoy books. Classic stories from that time include Treasure Island, Gulliver's Travels, The Swiss Family Robinson, Little Women, Tom Brown's School Days, and Rudyard Kipling's Just So's Stories. which endured for several generations. There were also a wide variety of picture books for younger children, and pop-up and other mechanical books, which appealed very much to the Victorian interest in invention. Annuals were popular from the turn of the 20th century and are still a staple Christmas present. We also have a large collection of comics and magazines, ranging from the informative children's newspaper to the Dandy, Beano, Bunty, and Jackie. As we saw in the Changing Childhood gallery, board games have been a popular family entertainment since the late 19th century, although many have much earlier origins. They can teach young children about taking turns and losing graciously, as well as being great fun. Some of the most enduring board games include Snakes and Ladders, Ludo, Monopoly, and Cluedo. Since the beginning of the 20th century, huge numbers of children have belonged to uniformed organisations, such as the Cubs, Scouts, Brownies, Guides, and the Boys and Girls Brigades. These groups were initially set up to give children something worthwhile to do and to keep them off the streets, and began with moral and religious intentions. Although some of this ethos remains today, there is more emphasis on leadership and sporting skills and activities. Arts and crafts of all kinds were very popular from the mid-19th century. And we have examples here of model making, painting, and needlework. Until the turn of the 20th century, needlework was an essential skill for girls, as most women would have to mend, if not make, some of their household linen and underwear, as well as a baby's layette. While many girls needed to develop practical skills, those from more affluent families would learn decorative needlework for their own entertainment. A large section of this gallery is devoted to a hobbies workshop, containing the kinds of crafts that boys might have done in their garden shed, or with some adult supervision. At least they were aimed at boys. There is a fret saw for making wooden animals and other toys, a large Ferris wheel made from Meccano, and a variety of construction toys and manuals. We also have a display of street games, including marbles, skipping ropes, whips and tops, Diablos, and yo-yos. These traditional games were very popular until the 1960s and 70s, when children began to play more with larger outdoor toys, such as bikes, scooters, and roller skates. The final gallery in the museum displays a selection of children's costume. This gallery is darker than other galleries in order to preserve the textiles on display. The Museum of Childhood has a large costume collection, mostly dating from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century. It can be difficult to collect children's clothes, as most are worn out or passed on to siblings and friends. Most are generally only kept for sentimental reasons, particularly baby clothes. This gallery has 4 displays. The first is a classroom showing the uniform of George Watson's School in Edinburgh. School uniform was first worn in charitable schools and later became popular in public schools, helping to give each school an identity. Modern uniform developed from sportswear, such as blazers, caps, badges and polo shirts. Next, visitors can see a street scene, showing a variety of Victorian fashions. These show how restrictive children's clothes were, with stiff collars, stays, and voluminous skirts. The styles were closely modelled on adult clothes, although there were some designed particularly for children. These include the sailor suit, which was a very popular outfit throughout the Victorian and Edwardian periods for both boys and girls. It was originally inspired by Winterhalter's portrait of the Prince of Wales dressed in naval costume. Sailor suits were available in a variety of styles, fabrics, and shades of blue and white. The third display is a fancy dress party. During the Victorian period, fancy dress parties were very elaborate affairs, with expensive costumes available to buy or hire, such as this green velvet outfit, representing Sir Walter Raleigh. From the early 20th century, costumes became more informal and improvised, often made at home by inventive parents. As sewing skills diminished, costumes were often made out of cardboard, bin liners, or cast-off clothes. Nowadays, dressing up costumes are relatively cheap to buy. The final display shows an Edwardian day nursery, where children are dressed in pale colours and more comfortable styles. The fashion for white or pale clothing reflects a change in attitudes to children, who are now thought of as innocent in nature, in contrast to the Victorian period when many people thought children were born sinful and needed to be corrected. Although these clothes are more comfortable, they are still quite elaborate, and it must have taken a lot of hard work to keep them clean. We hope that you've enjoyed this whistle-stop tour of the Museum of Childhood. There is so much more to explore in our galleries, and so many stories to uncover, so why not pay us a visit soon? We are located at 42 High Street, Edinburgh, EH1 1TG, opposite John Knox House. To learn more about upcoming events and exhibitions, visit edinburghmuseums.org.uk or follow us on Facebook at Edinburgh Museums and Galleries or on Twitter at EdinCulture.